Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, March 31st, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at Joe Biden's best performance, his best possibility in the 2024 electoral map, sort of the best case scenario for the Biden campaign for this coming November. Now, I was taking a look at the videos that I made during the 2020 election when Donald Trump and Joe Biden were facing up against each other, and around this time at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we found that there was a lot of speculation about what would be the best case scenario for both Trump and Biden. And looking at these videos that I published 4 years ago, I found that I actually did one on March 22nd, 2020, titled The Best Case for Joe Biden in the 2020 Election, and I thought that it would be timely to do one now, especially as we look ahead to the general election season, the summertime, the conventions, and of course, the final stretch of the campaign season, just to sort of compare where Joe Biden and Donald Trump actually do in the eventual election versus what we could see to be their best performances predicted this far out in advance. Now, I will first say that this election is not like the last one. I can actually show you what my electoral map looked like 4 years ago, roughly 4 years ago today, with Joe Biden receiving 359 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 179. And so realistically speaking, I think this is something that was very far off from reality, but looking at it, it wasn't too far off from what could have been possible, assuming the election had gone seamlessly and flawlessly for President Biden, which very obviously it did not. It was an election that was still very, very close, and a lot of things came down to very important battleground states, but that's of course the fun and joy of exploring these hypotheticals and a reason why I'm exploring one now for the 2024 election. So to preface, the 2024 general election polls are a lot more grim for Democrats than they were 4 years ago. 4 years ago today, Joe Biden was up by the national metric of 5.8%. Hillary Clinton led Donald Trump by 10.6%, and today Donald Trump leads by 1. So nearly an 12-point shift from 2016, a 7-point shift from 2020, but still Joe Biden seems to be in the running. So since you know this, and since you know that we're going into this electoral prediction with that being kept in mind, you know you have to take a look at this and say, you know what, maybe Joe Biden won't have a map that looks like this when it comes down to the best case scenario. And that's going to be the fact here. I think what we're going to take a look at closely is the margins in states where maybe we could see some improvement. Maybe we could see, Biden and, Trump do better or worse. Obviously, Biden's going to be the one coming up with the upper hand here. But, it'll be quite interesting to see exactly how far partisan some states have gotten that even in a best case scenario, aren't going to narrow down beyond safe for the GOP. And I think it'll really tell a story here about our national composition, about where we are on that front, and I think it's certainly worthwhile to take a look at. So as we characterize these states, we come to our traditional roughly 183, 181 electoral votes that we always determine to be safe for the Democratic Party. These are states and districts here that really aren't going to go to the GOP no matter how much they are tugged onto, right? That means that these states, probably in the best case scenario map for the GOP, are also going to be roughly 183, 182, 181 electoral votes in favor of the Democratic Party. But of course, in a best case scenario map for Joe Biden, we would need to see some shifts from 2020. And I think it's not entirely out of question. I think we could see some states like Colorado move over into the safe Democratic column. For instance, Colorado was won by 13.5% by President Biden in the 2020 election. I could see it being 15 in 2024, assuming that you're seeing this type of uniform shift in favor of President Biden getting closer towards the election. Again, I don't think that's what happened today. This is all hypothetical. This is assuming everything goes right from here and now to November 5th. But of course, Colorado, I think, would be one of the first states to move over into the safe Democratic column. Now, I'm a bit cautious to include Virginia and New Mexico in this bunch. I think realistically speaking, even in a best case scenario, they're not going to be safe blue. I understand they were likely blue in the last election, but both of them were roughly 10, 11 points in favor of President Biden. I think we could see some minimal movement. I don't think a best case scenario, though, for President Biden is winning states like Iowa and Ohio, as I predicted back in 2020. I think this election is very, very different, and because we've seen these candidates before, we can make a really, really rational decision here in deciding that, Joe Biden's going to be winning some states, but it's not going to be this massive, massive blowout, even in a best case scenario. And so we'll kick it off by characterizing those states as likely blue states in this election. And again, that's not something I see as being too, in fact, this is actually how I see it happening in the real election, but I think for many of these other ones won't be too far off from reality. So we start off with 211 electoral votes before we get into any of the real swing states. That makes sense, right? These are all states that were won by President Biden in the last few elections. I would also group in, of course, the same states that he won by a likely margin in 2020 in that column as well. States like Minnesota, and New Hampshire, which were likely blue, that will likely be likely blue as well. Nebraska second, pretty much going to be solidly blue, and that gives Democrats 226 electoral votes. But of course, we have some states here that I think are going to be moved over even further in the Democratic column than they otherwise were. I think based on where we are, though, in these general election numbers, they aren't looking too hot. I think a best case scenario here for Joe Biden is significant improvements in these battleground states, but it's not going to be blowing them out of the water. I think it's very different again from 2020, where we had states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania pretty much solidified as likely blue. That won't be the case, even in this best case scenario. These states are going to be close, and I think Biden really has to claw his way back up because, again, take a look at these states. There's not a single swing state where you can find that Biden is leading. So right now, I'd say best case scenario from what we understand about electoral politics, what we understand about the American electorate today, we would be cautious to characterize these states as likely blue. But I will say there's one. There is one out of the bunch, and it's not the state of Michigan that I'd consider to be likely blue. It is the state of Pennsylvania, which has shown consistency in terms of its willingness to support President Biden when every other state will not. Right now, Joe Biden's down 0.2%, the narrowest out of all of the swing states. He led here for a while, led here for a few weeks. In fact, I actually think the entire month of February and the end week of January. Since then, Donald Trump has taken a lead again by 0.2%, but fundamentally, Pennsylvania, I think, is the state that if you do see major improvements for President Biden, that will be the state that moves over into the Biden 5 to 6 point column. But that pretty much brings us to 245 electoral votes for President Biden. I think this also just goes to show that this election is not super favorable towards the Democratic Party currently. I think what we have, really understood about it is, yes, Biden is ahead in fundraising. He is ahead when it comes down to mobilization. He has most of the offices on the ground. He has most of the groundwork figured out. He has a stronger HQ. He has a hiring pool that is yet, expected to double and triple going into the summer and fall months of the election cycle. With that being said, he's still falling behind. There is still some major disconnect between him, the administration, the campaign, the voters. And I think what you are finding is without this unified and central presence that was pivotal in Obama's reelection, that was pivotal in Trump's election in the first time, I think Biden, too, is not getting as much support as 2020 just because this election feels and is different. There is no urgency behind Donald Trump. There's no expectation that something would radically change if Biden is reelected. And so I think you're seeing a decreased level of enthusiasm amongst Democrats, amongst independents, amongst Republicans even, that are upset with this matchup yet again. But nothing's going to change because that's exactly what this matchup is. It's Trump and Biden again, and it'll be interesting to see how voters genuinely react to that as we get closer and closer to the election. So to keep moving on and moving forward, I would say there are states here that I think would be lean blue states in a best case scenario, and there's quite a few of them. That includes states like Wisconsin and Michigan, which I don't think is too far off from reality. I think there's a very strong possibility here that Biden does win them, even in the regular election, by 1 to 2 points. But here it'd be somewhere around 3, 4, nearing 5 points. I don't think you're going to see Michigan have that much of a reversal in favor of Biden. I think he's really lost a lot of core support that simply will not vote this November, and he will feel that. The question is, though, is that counteracted by white suburban voters? Is that counteracted by other minority groups, right? In specific, what I'm referencing here is the Arab American community in Dearborn that has been crucial and pivotal to Democrats' elections in the past that's not turning out for President Biden. That big chunk of voters that voted 20% uncommitted in the state primary. In Wisconsin, they have their primary coming up this Tuesday. We'll be interested to see what happens there, but I'd say, based on the numbers we're seeing, Wisconsin could easily be a lean blue state. So that already brings Biden to 270 electoral votes, but he has a few more to go. Nevada, I would say, is a lean blue state. In line with where it was in 2020, I think we have seen some major reversal in support in Nevada. I do believe, though, history trumps all. We know Nevada is historically a very Democratic state, but I will say, Joe Lombardo did win in 2022, and Donald Trump's lead here by 3 points should worry Democrats, because although they do overestimate Republicans, sometimes these are telling signs, and I think they are currently in this state. But of course, Nevada, a lean blue state. I don't think it'll move over until likely. I think it has just historically been one of those states where Democrats do well in, but, when they say they do well, and it means they're winning another 6-year term, they're winning another 4-year term of the presidency. But the problem is that the margins here are never great for Democrats. Even in 2018, it was still 5 points in favor of Jackie Rosen. Granted, she was running against an incumbent, but, you get the gist. Arizona, I'd move over to lean blue alongside Georgia, which I think might surprise some people. I think they look at this and say, at most, they're going to be tilt blue because that's what they were back in 2020. No, right? I think there is certainly a reality in which these states become lean blue states, become more pro-Democrat than they were in the last election, because that's the nature of best case scenarios. And honestly, honestly speaking, we saw it happen in 2022. Arizona voted 5 points in favor of the Democratic nominee for Senate, 2 points in favor of the Democratic nominee for Senate in Georgia. And so these electorates, these states that rejected Donald Trump, have elected Democrats by larger margins, and I think Joe Biden could be one of them in this upcoming one. And so taking a look at the remainder of the electoral map, we really don't have that many states where Joe Biden is expected to do quite well in. I'd say North Carolina is the last state I would consider to be a lean blue state, but this, again, is a best-case scenario. I think if everything goes right between now and November, you could be inching towards this map. I think this could be a very realistic map in that scenario. But right now, I don't see that happening, and right now, I'd say North Carolina is a red state. But of course, in this circumstance, it's a blue one. And so that brings us to 319 electoral votes for Joe Biden. Republicans, of course, have yet to see characterizations, but I will preface by saying a lot of the remaining electoral votes are going to go to the GOP, if not all of them, right? I think as we get closer and as we get through the safe states and likely states, you'll start to see that because of polarization, because this is a rematch election, because Biden has lost support in some states and among some regions of the country, you will find that this map may not be as shocking or as pro-Dem as it was in 2020, because it's not the same election. This might have been the best case scenario in 2020. Of course, time will tell, and time did tell that maybe this wasn't the case, right? The fact is Georgia did go blue even in this best case scenario, and I think that was far off to predict that it wouldn't. But this time around, I don't really see much movement, especially since we've been given these candidates before. Voters have been able to make a decision on these candidates before. I don't know if we're really going to see that much movement. There are, of course, going to always be safe red states, safe red districts. States like Nebraska are always going to be safe, for the Republican Party. I will say, though, some of these states might see some narrowing down in terms of margins. For instance, a state like South Carolina, which was under 15 points last time, might be likely again. I'm not going to waste your time in explaining why I think these states might narrow up. I just think that they will. I think you're going to see a very narrow improvement for Joe Biden in these states. But again, it's nothing really to gloat about. It really just shows that there has been some reversion in margin, some improvement for President Biden. But again, it really doesn't matter because it's a winner-take-all system. And so with that, Republicans are at 125 electoral votes. Indiana, Missouri, Mississippi, South Carolina, Kansas, Utah, Montana, and Alaska, all likely red states. I'd actually pull Alaska from that because I think there's another scenario in which it narrows down to lean in the best case situation, especially with Mary Peltola on the ballot. But for now, I'd say we have roughly 97 remaining electoral votes, and we certainly do have a lean red states. In fact, I'd go so far as to saying that the remainder of this map is also lean red. I think that Florida, even in its best case, is not going to be tilt red. I think Texas, even in its best case, is going to be lean red. In the 2020 election, I had Texas as a tilt red state. So with all of these states being characterized in, I think, first of all, this map is one you certainly could have seen predicted back in 2020 as the normal expected prediction. I think this time it's the best case for President Biden as of today. These numbers are not looking so hot. The Arizona ones, the Nevada ones, the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, right, North Carolina, Georgia, they aren't doing so well. Biden is not doing so well. The Trump versus Biden numbers are not doing so well. And I think that is a fundamental problem that the Biden campaign must combat and must tackle. I will say equally that these numbers today, I do not think will be super reflected in the actual outcome of the election this November. I think what you have found is that there's a lot of sensationalism around this being a horse race, around Trump making a comeback. And while I do not at all want to insinuate that I think the polls are lying to us or their polls are intentionally being misleading, I do believe that in some capacity, a lot of this is being overhyped, being overanalyzed, being incorrectly understood. And I think especially looking back at the 2022 midterms, I will caution in saying that the polls aren't always correct. And in the most recent election, they severely underestimated Democrats in a significant number of battleground states. And the same could be happening this time around. But this is it. This is what I think Biden's ceiling is. I know it may not be super strong for the Biden campaign, and that might be surprising to some of you guys. But margins do matter. I do think margins absolutely matter. When you narrow down a state like Alaska and Texas and Florida to lean red states in an election like this one, it's an improvement from the last one and certainly tells a story. If Pennsylvania gets more than 5 points in favor of Biden, if Colorado becomes safe, this shows, although the map isn't drastically and significantly changing from the last one, there was pushback against President Trump. And there was pushback against all the Republicans in these states. I think a map like this one would end up with a Democratic majority in the House, a Democratic majority in the Senate, and of course, a Democratic administration. It would be, in effect, one of the most substantial and significant elections in favor of Democrats should they find themselves in a trifecta following the 2024 race. It would take a lot. Almost everything would have to go correct between now and November in order for a map like this one to populate, to come up on election night, but it's not too far out of reality. And I will say, you can take a look at it. You can take a look at this map and the eventual election result, because depending on what happens, especially related to Donald Trump's criminal proceedings, especially what happens with, all of this potential time, October surprises between now and Election Day, a map like this one may not be too far off from reality on what we see on November 6th, 2024. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.